And Michael, was this the reason that US had to jump into this conflict, and they had to, like Vice President Vance went to speak to Modi and directly, and on May 10th, just hours after Vance had declared that it is not US's business to intervene in this conflict?
I mean, I think all along, despite the messaging from the US of not wanting to get involved, I think all along there was a desire on the part of the US to keep a focus on what was happening. There were consistent calls for de-escalation. And in fact, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he was in contact with his counterparts in India and Pakistan several times in the days leading up to the ceasefire. But to your question, I think that why the U.S. decided to get involved to help broker the ceasefire. Two reasons. The first one is just escalation dynamics. The fact that, as we've been discussing, you had these repeated tit-for-tat cycles of hits on both sides. And I think that was really the U.S. quite concerned. And two, the other reason, and I think this is the core reason, is indeed concerns about nuclear escalation risks. And there's already been a fair amount of reportage on this in the U.S. that when you started having several particular sites that were targeted, particularly the Khan base in Rawalpindi, and then also the public announcement by Islamabad that it was going to convene its National Command Authority. I think this is when the U.S. really started to get concerned and started to really worry about nuclear escalation risks. And indeed, that's what prompted.
And was India desperate for a ceasefire, in your opinion?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
It seemed to me that based on the messaging coming from each capital, that both capitals would have been perfectly comfortable to continue going for a few more rounds. But I would also argue, several things. One, neither country wanted a war. Neither country wanted an all-out war. Neither country could afford an all-out war. And I think that you could argue that at that point, right when the talks for the ceasefire started to begin, each side could have claimed victory. They had each dealt damage to the other's military. So, I think that they were perhaps ready for the idea of a ceasefire, even though it appeared that they would have been happy to continue going for another round or two. But the fact that the ceasefire was successful, the fact that the U.S. pitch for the ceasefire actually worked, that suggests that there was receptivity from the Indian side and also from the Pakistani side.
Right. And does Pakistan now hold a deterrence advantage over India, especially after the way Pakistan had responded and retaliated?
Well, Pakistan responded to each of the Indian strikes quite with a lot of muscle and very quickly as well. And I do think that there may be some in India that don't think Pakistan has the capacity to respond to these Indian strikes. So absolutely, and indeed,
So Pakistan surprised India and a lot of other people in the world as well.
I think, not in terms of observers and analysts that follow these dynamics, but
Right.
I think that particularly among the public in India didn't think that Pakistan would have the capacity to respond. And let's be very clear, India has never denied that several of its jets were shot down by Pakistan. So, I think it's true that Pakistan did shoot down several Indian jets. That is a major development, I think. It's really a milestone development in India-Pakistan relations, and I think it says a lot. It is an embarrassment for the Indian military to have several of its fighter jets shot down by Pakistan, but I think that also will psychologically have an impact and make very clear that, Pakistan does have the damage to hit back hard against India's military in ways that can be very impactful.
Right. And was the Chinese factor a surprise? The way J-10Cs were used to counter French Rafales, or the Chinese technology was used to launch cyber attacks in India?
No, I don't think this was surprising. It's well known that China has this very deep alliance with Pakistan, and that China is a key supplier of weaponry to Pakistan. And I think that, I know that the U.S. imposes significant limits on how Pakistan can use U.S.-made F-16. So it's only natural Pakistan would want to use those that, it's authorized to use Chinese-made F-16s for contingencies such as the ones that played out in this crisis with India.
Right. And how would Modi now react? Like, will Modi crumble under the fallout of the military damage Pakistan has inflicted upon India, or will he again hit back once he recovers from this setback? How do you look at this post-ceasefire scenario between the two countries?
Well, I mean, it's a fragile ceasefire. I mean, of course, there were
Okay.
several reported violations soon after it was put in place. It had, there were no violations over the last day or so, which is important. But it's the bottom line. I mean, the tensions, or should I say, the root drivers of the tensions in this relationship have not gone away, quite frankly. And the fact that you had such significant levels of force being used against the other. That suggests each country is perfectly comfortable using force, limited force, but still significant levels of force under the nuclear umbrella. And so I think it's just a matter of time before you have the next trigger event that could precipitate another crisis, much like the one that played out over the last week.
Right. And how do you foresee India's intentions regarding talks with Pakistan on a neutral venue to discuss broader set of issues as indicated by Secretary Rubio? Will India come to the table or will it evade the talks?
It's surprising, quite frankly. I can't imagine India wanting to participate in talks with Pakistan. It's had a pretty consistent policy for many years that it has no interest in talks with Pakistan. I think that perhaps the U.S. figured that in order to get agreement from Pakistan for a ceasefire, that it would be important to emphasize the idea that there would be these talks. But again, India has taken a very rigid position for much of Modi's period in power, that there's really no interest in talks. And of course, for India, the concern is that any talks with Pakistan would come around to the issue of Kashmir, which India's position is that there's nothing to discuss. So I would be skeptical if
Okay.
these talks develop. If they do, I suspect they would be on issues that are fairly modest, low-hanging fruit. Though I'm not sure what those would be. The relations are so fraught. I'm not
Okay.
sure what to talk about.
So no talks on Kashmir at least.
Oh
Because,
yeah,
yeah.
definitely not. Yeah, and India has also made clear that it's not going to change its position on the various punitive measures it took, economic, diplomatic measures like suspending the Indus Waters Treaty. So that suggests that these talks, if they happen, would not talk about the idea of India trying to basically bring back the Indus Waters Treaty after having suspended it. They've said that they're not going to change that decision.
Okay, so the US mediation between Pakistan and India might not work as per your assessment, and India might not come to the tables.
I mean, I guess it's separate issues. I mean, the U.S. mediation worked in the sense that it helped broker a ceasefire, which is in place right now. But the terms of the ceasefire, which entail, these, according to the U.S. side, these talks happening in a neutral site. I think that it could be tough to get to that, but my understanding is that the Indian and Pakistani sides have met or will meet. There'll be some contacts and discussions, so perhaps there'll be some discussion about the possibility for holding those talks in a neutral site. And it's important to note that there was no mention from India's government, about this idea of talks. It was only from the U.S. side, and I'm sure the Pakistani side might welcome them too. But I think India is just very uncomfortable with that idea of holding talks with Pakistan outside of those that are mandated by bilateral treaty obligations. Exchanging information about prisoners.
So basically, a neutral venue is something that India doesn't like. But what do you think is the reason for this reluctance?
I mean, as I said before, well, India's stated position is essentially that it cannot hold talks with Pakistan until Pakistan deals with its cross-border terrorism issue. So India has this mantra of no talks with terror. I have no reason to think that India's position has changed in that regard. And then the other issue, as I said before, is the Kashmir issue. That India's views that any talks with Pakistan would ultimately have to come back to the Kashmir issue, which in India's view is not up for discussion.
Right. And what do you think will happen to the Indus Water Treaty? Can US help Pakistan get it restored?
I mean, I think if anyone could help, it would be the World Bank, because, of course, the World Bank co-signed the treaty, it mediated it. But that depends on what approach the World Bank might want to take to it. But this is such an important issue, and we could talk about the various steps India's taken to try to pressure Pakistan. But suspending this treaty is really the step that, not now, but over the longer term, could have very serious implications for Pakistanis, not necessarily just for the government or the military, but the common people of Pakistan, given the significant impacts it could have on livelihoods, on agriculture, on public health, and so much. So I do hope that if they are able to talk, the two sides, that there would be an opportunity to discuss the possibility of revoking that suspension. But to be very honest with you, my sense is that India, for quite some time, has been wanting to suspend the treaty, and that it might have seen this crisis with Pakistan as an opportunity, that it had an excuse to finally say, okay, let's back away from it. So I simply don't think India is going to be ready to come back to the treaty anytime soon.
Right. And finally, Michael, how do you read the Chinese strategic and military dominance coming to the fore following Pakistan's response? Is it something which now both India and US will have to deal with? Like, is China having the last laugh?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in terms of its, the fact that Pakistan was using Chinese-made weaponry to shoot down Indian jets that, in at least several cases, were French-made.
Yeah.
I think that's something that many military analysts are going to be studying for a very long time. But this is absolutely a victory for China, and of course for Pakistan as well. Pakistan, has been able to diversify its sources of arms suppliers, as its relationship with the U.S. has become more uncertain. So it really is quite dependent on China, and we've seen how important that is. But the fact that Pakistan may now be increasingly relying on Turkish weaponry is important as well, and I think that gives it an advantage, given that India has been able to, for quite some time, do a good job of diversifying its own support sources of arms suppliers, the Russians, but now the U.S., the Israelis, and the French, among others.